The grand ballroom of Ashford Manor shimmered under the glow of countless crystal chandeliers, each prism refracting candlelight into 1,000 tiny stars that danced across the polished parquet. Outside, a drizzle had begun, streaking the carriage windows with silvered rivulets that blurred the view of arriving guests, their muffled footfalls on wet cobblestones announcing each arrival with a subtle thrum of anticipation. Inside, the air was heavy with perfumed finery, roses, orange blossoms, and the faintest trace of amber from the Duke's private blend of cologne. Gentlemen in tailored coats exchanged nods of deferential recognition, while ladies in gowns of silk and satin whispered behind fans, their laughter like chimes caught in a winter breeze. Miss Evangeline Hartwell stood near the northern wall, her gloved hands lightly clasping the folds of her modest ivory gown. Her dress lacked the elaborate embroidery favored by the wealthiest débutantes, its simplicity marking her as quietly refined yet painfully ordinary in the eyes of the evening's onlookers. She felt the weight of every gaze, the subtle judgment of society, like a chill wind pressing against her spine. Her cheeks, faintly flushed from the warmth of the room and the persistent embarrassment she carried, betrayed a vulnerability that her posture sought to conceal. She longed to vanish behind one of the towering gilded mirrors, to dissolve into the soft shadows of the corners where whispered criticisms might not reach her ears. It was then that he appeared. The Duke of Ashford, tall and unrelenting, moved through the throng with the ease of one accustomed to command. Every gesture, from the tilt of his chin to the flick of his gloved hand, was precise, measured, and practiced for maximum effect. His dark eyes, luminous beneath arched brows, swept the room as if weighing each guest for their merit or their folly. When they settled upon Evangeline, she felt the familiar constriction of dread, the knot of shame tightening in her chest. He smiled, and it was a smile that carried both amusement and a subtle cruelty, the kind that cut through the finest silks and left a sting far sharper than any whisper behind a fan. "Ah," he said, his voice a low, cultured murmur that somehow carried to the far corners of the ballroom. "The ever-pleasant Miss Hartwell. One wonders how she manages to maintain such quiet dignity among so much splendor." There was a pause, deliberate and excruciating, as if savoring the impact of his words. "Though I confess," he added, with a tilt of his head that made the words feel like a knife wrapped in velvet, "there is a certain charm in the attempt at grandeur when one so clearly falls short." The ballroom seemed to still for a heartbeat, the collective intake of breath sharp and palpable. Evangeline's fingers tightened around the folds of her gown, knuckles whitening, yet she forced her posture to remain upright. The sting of humiliation washed over her, hot and sudden, and yet beneath it was a defiant ember she could scarcely name. She had endured such remarks in whispers before, in letters and chance encounters, but never with such a public, deliberate flourish. The heat of the Duke's scrutiny pressed against her like the hands of a sculptor, shaping her shame into a visible, inescapable form. Whispers rose among the onlookers, a delicate cascade of scandal and judgment. "Did you hear what he said?" one lady murmured, her fan fluttering as if it could shield her from the impropriety of interest. "How cruel, and yet how fitting," another added, her voice tinged with fascination rather than sympathy. "She is so pale, so unremarkable. Surely he delights in pointing it out." Every syllable seemed to hammer into Evangeline's consciousness, amplifying her self-consciousness while simultaneously forcing her awareness of the eyes that tracked her every move. Her mind, trained in years of careful observation and temperance, raced to craft a mask of composure. She lifted her chin, offered a polite, measured smile, and inclined her head with the smallest degree of elegance. Yet even as she performed the social dance with precision, she could feel the weight of the Duke's gaze, the subtle calculation behind his every glance. It was not mere observation. It was judgment, amusement, and a test of endurance all at once. For a moment, Evangeline considered retreating to the veranda, letting the rain outside mingle with the tears she fought to suppress. But she did not move. Instead, she drew a quiet breath, inhaling the scent of roses and beeswax, of polished wood and cold silver. She allowed herself the smallest flicker of defiance, the awareness that though she was diminished in the eyes of society, she retained the dignity of her own quiet heart. The Duke had power here, and yet he could not touch that. He approached, his steps deliberate and slow, so that every inch of the room seemed to acknowledge his passage. "Your courage, Miss Hartwell," he said softly, leaning just enough that his words brushed her ear, "is admirable, though it is, I fear, entirely misplaced." There was a precision in his cruelty, an artistry in how he layered mockery beneath the surface of civility that left Evangeline both trembling and oddly exhilarated. It was the first time she had sensed that beneath the mask of disdain there might exist a challenge, an invitation rather than mere derision. As he departed, sweeping through the crowd with a wave of his gloved hand and the faintest curl of a smile, he left behind more than embarrassment. In his absence, there came a small, folded note, delicate as a bird's feather, tucked into the hand that had brushed against hers. It bore a single line, penned in a script both elegant and deliberate. "You will understand one night, perhaps." Evangeline's fingers lingered on the paper, tracing the words with a tremulous reverence. Her pulse thrummed not merely with shame, but with a curiosity that startled her own heart. The ballroom continued its clamor. Music, laughter, the faint clatter of champagne glasses, but a quiet world had opened between her fingers and the whispered promise contained within that note. It was a world both dangerous and thrilling, a space where humiliation and hope intersected, where the cruelty of one could become the curiosity of another, and where the shape of her future might shift with a single, clandestine revelation. She folded the note carefully, pressing it to her chest as though it were a talisman against both shame and longing. Her eyes lifted to the chandeliers, to the glittering reflection of the storm outside upon polished floors, and she imagined a night where understanding might finally bloom, where the sting of ridicule could give way to something altogether different. The Duke had mocked her, exposed her, made her blood rush with a mixture of fear and fascination, and yet, in that mocking, he had left a trace of intrigue, a whisper that promised more than the cruelty of the present moment. And so, amidst the whirl of silk and laughter, the prickle of judgment and the hum of admiration, Evangeline Hartwell stood quietly, her heart both heavy and unsteady, holding in her hands a note that suggested that everything she had suffered tonight might be only the beginning. Outside, the rain continued its soft drum against the windows, silvered and relentless, as though heralding the secret night that waited somewhere in the shadows, an unknown reckoning, a promise of understanding, a shift that could change everything. The morning after the ball, Evangeline awoke to the soft patter of rain against her window pane, the sound both soothing and relentless, as though the world itself wished to remind her of the night's events. The note still lay upon her dressing table, its delicate folds now familiar, a fragile bridge between shame and curiosity. Yet beneath it, a small package had been placed, a velvet box no larger than a lady's thimble, tied with a ribbon of deepest sapphire. Her breath caught, and her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the lid, revealing a string of pearls, lustrous and perfect, catching the gray morning light like captured raindrops. She had seen such pearls in the windows of Bond Street jewelers, and the thought that they had been chosen for her, an unassuming girl, the subject of society's whispers, both startled and unnerved her. There was no accompanying card, no signature, only the silent assertion of their existence, a quiet challenge that demanded acknowledgement. Evangeline traced her fingers over each pearl, their cool surface a stark contrast to the heat rising in her cheeks. The gift was exquisite, yet it carried an unspoken question. Why her, and why now? Society, as if attuned to the smallest flutter of intrigue, wasted no time in responding. Letters arrived, sealed in crisp cream envelopes, delicate with the official monograms of the city's most observant matrons. One contained a subtle, half-concealed jab. A pearl for Miss Hartwell? Surely it is some mistake or jest. We are eager to hear she will wear it boldly or hide it in shame. Another, brimming with thinly veiled curiosity, posed an even more direct question. Who could have possibly admired her in this way? The Duke, perhaps, or some other daring admirer. Evangeline read each note with a mixture of alarm and fascination. The scandalous delight of society was palpable. Every whispered suspicion felt like a hand tracing her spine, prickling both shame and an unexpected thrill. She had spent years learning the manners and subtleties that allowed a woman to navigate such scrutiny without faltering. Yet now she was caught in a storm of attention she had neither invited nor entirely desired. She could almost hear the ripple of gossip passing from drawing room to tea table, felt the weight of eyes upon her even in her own modest home. She dressed carefully, selecting a gown of pale lavender, accented with a ribbon the same shade as the velvet tie upon the pearl box. The ensemble was deliberate, measured, a quiet assertion of dignity that dared society to whisper but not to wound. Each movement she made, each delicate adjustment of sleeve and collar, was a performance, a silent dialogue with a world that had so readily mocked her the night before. Yet even as she prepared, a curious excitement mingled with her apprehension. Perhaps, she thought, this small token, this enigmatic gesture, was the beginning of something unforeseen, a shift in the rigid patterns that had governed her life. The day was spent among the women of her acquaintance, who flitted about parlors and garden terraces, gossiping and observing with precise calculation. One acquaintance, Lady Whitmore, a sharp-eyed woman with a predilection for speculation, approached Evangeline with a curious tilt of her head. "How fortunate you are," she said lightly, though her tone carried the weight of insinuation, "to have been remembered in such a manner. A gift so delicate, yet so deliberate. Tell me, dear Miss Hartwell, do you understand its origin?" Evangeline smiled, a controlled, almost neutral gesture, though her heart fluttered like a captive bird. "I do not, Lady Whitmore," she admitted, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion within her. "Nor, I confess, do I wish to presume upon what I do not yet know." There is a careful balance in her phrasing, an acknowledgment without revelation, a subtle defiance wrapped in humility. The lady inclined her head, satisfaction and curiosity mingling in her gaze, then moved on, leaving Evangeline with a renewed awareness of the scrutiny that pressed upon her from all sides. As afternoon waned, Evangeline ventured into the garden, seeking solace among the clipped hedges and frost-kissed roses. The drizzle had ceased, leaving the paths glistening with tiny beads of moisture that reflected the weak November sun. It was there, amid the soft rustle of leaves and the faint perfume of winter roses, that she found a second token, smaller and less ornate than the pearls, yet equally deliberate. A single delicate rose, its petals a soft blush of pink, placed upon a marble bench where she often paused. A card accompanied it, so simple as to seem almost mundane, yet every word bore the weight of intention, for your courage and patience. Some truths are revealed only when the heart is prepared. The words made her pulse quicken, stirring a mixture of dread and hope, a trembling awareness that the one who mocked her most might also be the one to notice her worth. She pressed the rose to her cheek, inhaling its gentle fragrance, and wondered how a single gesture could undo years of ridicule, or perhaps, she dared not yet admit it, rewrite the narrative entirely. The society's whispers grew louder, even in the relative solitude of the garden. Servants, neighbors, and chance observers carried fragments of the story: pearls, roses, cryptic notes. Each fragment was a spark, igniting imagination and speculation in drawing rooms and tea parlors alike. The notion that the Duke of Ashford, so often merciless in his wit, could engage in such delicate attentions toward Evangeline was the kind of scandal that sharpened tongues and widened eyes. She felt herself caught in the eye of a storm both exhilarating and terrifying, where admiration and ridicule coexisted in the same breath, and the line between humility and triumph became impossibly thin. As dusk approached, she returned indoors, placing the rose beside the pearls on her dressing table. Together, they formed a quiet testament to the enigmatic attentions of one man, a contrast between the cruelty of his public mockery and the subtle poetry of his private gestures. Evangeline lingered, her reflection in the mirror softened by lamplight, and allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. She felt the weight of society pressing in, yet within that weight was a spark of something unforeseen. The acknowledgement of her worth, however enigmatic and veiled, had begun to bloom. Her thoughts returned, inevitably, to the Duke. What had prompted such tokens, such delicate, dangerous gestures? And why her, who had been so publicly diminished? The question lingered in her mind, unspoken, yet urgent, as the shadows of evening stretched across her room. Outside, the last light of day fell upon rain-slicked streets, and she imagined the Duke, somewhere in the expanse of Ashford Hall, observing her, orchestrating the next act of this quiet drama. A knock at the door startled her from reverie. It was the footman, bearing a sealed envelope, heavier than the usual correspondence. She took it with trembling hands, aware that every delivery might carry another spark of revelation, or another brush of humiliation. She broke the seal, her pulse quickening, and unfolded the letter to find only a single, elegant line, penned in the Duke's unmistakable hand. Tonight, all will be revealed. Evangeline's fingers lingered on the paper, the words both thrilling and terrifying. The day had begun with tokens and whispers, with subtle challenges and delicate provocations, and it now promised a night that could alter everything. The air seemed to hum around her. The ordinary furnishings of her room transformed into the stage for an unfolding drama she neither fully understood nor wished to resist. The pearls, the rose, the letter. They were no longer mere objects, but keys to a door she felt compelled to open, into a world where shame, curiosity, and desire intermingled with dangerous precision. And so, with the twilight settling over London and the first evening lamps casting long shadows across her walls, Evangeline Hartwell held the envelope close to her heart, feeling the flutter of anticipation and fear entwined. The tokens had ignited the whispers, the scandal had drawn the gaze of society, and now the promise of revelation hung in the air, a secret night waiting to unfold, poised between the cruelty of the past and the uncertain allure of what might come. The library of Ashford Hall was a sanctuary of shadow and flame, the tall windows draped in velvet curtains that muted the fading light of afternoon. Firelight danced across shelves lined with leather-bound tomes, their spines gleaming like watchful eyes, and cast a golden glow upon the polished oak floor. The scent of beeswax and old paper mingled with the faint smoke of the hearth, a warm contrast to the chill that lingered beyond the heavy doors. Evangeline Hartwell stepped lightly across the threshold, her heart a restless rhythm, her gloved fingers brushing the edge of a table polished to perfection. She had never been alone here with him, not outside the carefully orchestrated eye of society, and yet the invitation he had left, silent, deliberate, had compelled her to accept. The Duke of Ashford sat in a high-backed chair near the fire, his dark coat tailored to perfection, the faintest crease at the elbow betraying his casual attention to detail. He did not rise, did not speak immediately, and the weight of that quiet command pressed upon Evangeline with the same intensity as any sharp remark in a crowded ballroom. She lowered herself onto a chair opposite him, maintaining the posture of a lady accustomed to decorum, though beneath the still surface of her composure her pulse raced. The room was a crucible of intimacy and restraint, where every glance and pause carried meaning, where words would be measured as carefully as any delicate gift or whispered rumor. He studied her as though seeing her for the first time, and for a moment, Evangeline felt the curious sensation of exposure. Not shame this time, but raw attention that unsettled her carefully guarded heart. "Miss Hartwell," he said finally, his voice low and deliberate, "I confess there is a cruelty in me that I have long cultivated. It is an art, one that I wield freely, yet rarely with intent to wound. And yet, he paused, eyes darkening with a shadow she could not name. You have unsettled me, despite every precaution I've taken against such folly. Evangeline felt a faint shiver run down her spine, part apprehension, part recognition. She had endured his wit and mockery with patience, had cultivated a quiet dignity in response to his public jabs, but never had she imagined that beneath the polished cruelty lay a vulnerability of any kind. Your words are unexpected, Your Grace, she said softly, careful to preserve the civility that society demanded, though I must confess they are not entirely unwelcome. Her admission hovered in the room, delicate yet provocative, as though daring him to lower the guard he so meticulously maintained. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the angles of his face and throwing the room into a chiaroscuro of shadow and flame. I have spent years perfecting a mask, he said quietly, one that keeps the world at a precise distance. Yet in you, I find a perturbation I neither sought nor anticipated. There is a grace in your patience, a quiet courage beneath the surface that refuses to be ridiculed, no matter my intent. Each word was deliberate, measured, yet carried a tremor of sincerity that sent an unexpected warmth through Evangeline's chest. Her own defenses, honed over a lifetime of scrutiny, began to falter, revealing the fragile undercurrent of insecurity that had accompanied her from girlhood. I have been careful, she admitted, to navigate the world as it demands, to present a face that is acceptable to those who judge most harshly. And yet, even with such care, there are moments when one's dignity feels as if it might crumble beneath the weight of observation. Her voice was steady, though beneath it lay the tremor of vulnerability she rarely allowed anyone to see. He studied her, a faint shadow of admiration flickering across his features. You do not realize, he murmured, how seldom such honesty is met with anything other than scorn or indifference. Most would flinch, retreat, or attempt to appease with smiles and empty words. You do not. And perhaps that is why I've been drawn to mock, to test, and yet now find myself compelled to confess. His eyes softened, dark and luminous, and Evangeline felt the first real stirrings of intimacy, a connection forged in both truth and restraint. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air that seemed to dance between them, and for a moment, the library became a world unto itself, removed from the judgments of society and the cruel calculations of the ballroom. Evangeline allowed herself the smallest inhalation of relief, the recognition that here, in the hush of the library, she could speak and be heard without pretense. "And what is it you wish to confess, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though the firelight made each syllable tremble with significance. He leaned back slightly, the shadow of a smile touching his lips. "That I have erred," he said, "in assuming that mockery could shield me from admiration, or that cruelty might keep my heart unmoved. It seems, against my own design, that your presence unsettles me more than any affront or jest. I am fascinated by your dignity, by the quiet strength that belies the shyness imposed by the world." His admission was raw, unpolished in its sincerity, and Evangeline felt a curious warmth suffuse her, mingling with the long-familiar sting of his earlier mockery. The room seemed to shrink around them, the leather-bound volumes and polished oak fading into the background as the moment stretched taut between confession and understanding. Evangeline's hand brushed against her own chest, where the pearls from the morning still rested in memory, a subtle emblem of his attention and her tentative trust. "And yet," she said carefully, "you wield power with such precision, and I am unaccustomed to such scrutiny beyond mere observation. To be seen and understood in this way." She faltered, the word understood trembling between them, heavy with implication. He reached for her hand, the gesture both tentative and deliberate, a promise without words. "To be seen," he said softly, "is sometimes the greatest risk a man or woman may take, and yet it is the only path to truth, to understanding, and perhaps to connection. Evangeline felt her pulse quicken, the firelight catching in her eyes as the enormity of the moment unfolded. For the first time, mockery and admiration, shame and longing seemed to coexist in a delicate balance, as though the very tension between them was a bridge to something neither had fully anticipated. A sudden knock at the library door startled them both, the echo sharp in the quiet room, and Evangeline's heart leapt with a mixture of dread and anticipation. It was a reminder that the world outside, with its judgment and scrutiny, had not vanished, and that the intimacy they had briefly shared was fragile, poised on the edge of discovery. Yet even as she turned toward the door, the warmth of his gaze remained, the unspoken confession lingering in the air like smoke from the hearth, binding them together in a moment suspended between vulnerability and desire. As she held the door handle, poised to confront whatever intrusion threatened this fragile sanctuary, Evangeline's thoughts returned to the note, to the pearls, to the rose, and to the realization that the man who had mocked her most publicly had now revealed a depth she had scarcely imagined. The storm of ridicule had given way to the quiet revelation of truth, and the library, shadowed, fragrant, alive with firelight, had become the stage upon which her heart and the Duke's might finally collide. The hand upon the handle trembled slightly, and her breath caught, for whatever awaited beyond that door might alter the fragile clarity of this turning moment. And yet, in the hush of the library, with firelight and confession intertwining, Evangeline felt the first stirrings of a possibility that had seemed as distant as the stars outside, that the man who had humiliated her might also hold the key to her understanding, her desire, and perhaps her heart. The winter masquerade at Ashford Hall glittered with the opulence of candlelight and crystal, each flame mirrored a dozen times in gilded mirrors and the polished sheen of marble floors. Outside, snow fell in gentle sheets, catching the lantern light and turning the world beyond the windows into a realm of shimmering frost. Inside, the air was thick with perfume, the rustle of silk, and the quiet hum of society's watchful gaze, each guest a moving constellation in the grand design of gossip and expectation. Evangeline Hartwell moved with careful grace among them, the pearls at her throat a quiet testament to both daring and mystery, the rose from the garden pinned delicately at her corsage. Her heart thrummed beneath layers of satin and lace, a steady drum of anticipation that refused to be quieted by etiquette or fear. She caught sight of the Duke of Ashford across the ballroom, his mask a dark flourish of velvet that only partially concealed the familiar sharpness of his gaze. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to command, yet there was a subtle difference tonight, a tension beneath the surface of his assuredness. His eyes sought hers across the throng, and in that simple, unspoken acknowledgment, a current passed between them, a line of electricity drawn taut by anticipation and risk. The whispers of society seemed to fade into a muted hum, leaving only the pulse of proximity and the unspoken promise of revelation. The music shifted, a waltz rising in sweeping crescendos, and the Duke advanced toward her with deliberate elegance. Guests parted instinctively, sensing the drama that had quietly taken hold. When he reached her, he offered his hand, gloved and steady, and she placed her own within it, the contact both grounding and electrifying. "Miss Hartwell," he murmured, the words deliberate and intimate, despite the throng that surrounded them. "Tonight, appearances may deceive, yet truth is rarely so discreet. Will you allow me the honor of this dance?" Evangeline inclined her head, a slight flush coloring her pale cheeks, and allowed herself to be led into the circle of movement. The waltz carried them across the floor in a rhythm both structured and liberating, their bodies measured by the music, yet their connection ungoverned by formality. She could feel the warmth of his presence, the faint brush of his sleeve against hers, and the subtle pressure of his hand at the small of her back. Every glance, every tilt of the head carried weight. Every turn and sweep of the dance became a negotiation of intent and revelation. Society watched, of course. Eyes followed the pair with a mixture of curiosity, envy, and delight. The whispers began almost imperceptibly, coiling through the hall like smoke. See how he seeks her favor now? The Duke of Ashford, attentive to one so unassuming. Is it possible that he admires her, even as he once mocked her? Each fragment of speculation stung, yet beneath it, a strange exhilaration arose. Evangeline felt the shift, the subtle inversion of the power dynamic, as public amusement began to mingle with awe. The same man who had so recently exposed her to ridicule now demonstrated attention that could not be ignored. When the music softened into a slower passage, the Duke leaned slightly closer, his voice low and private. I must confess, Miss Hartwell, that my regard for you extends beyond the amusement I have so carelessly displayed. What I once took for wit, or perhaps cruelty, was merely a mask, one I have worn for too long. You have pierced it without knowing, and I find myself unable to retreat. His words were warm, deliberate, and tender in a manner that seemed to fold the world around them into a small, intimate sphere. Evangeline's chest rose and fell with unsteady breaths. And I, she admitted softly, have long sought to understand the man behind the mask. I could not imagine that beneath your sharp tongue there lay a heart capable of such attention, such discernment. Her words trembled, fragile as spun glass, yet they carried a courage that both surprised and steadied her. The gaze he fixed upon her acknowledged her vulnerability without exploiting it, and for the first time she sensed that the public stage and the private heart might coexist without contradiction. The Duke's hand, warm and commanding, found hers again. The world, he said, is eager to see us fail, to whisper and mock, to delight in the smallest misstep. Yet I find that your dignity, your composure, has not merely endured, it has commanded my admiration. I have come to respect you, Miss Hartwell, in a manner that I can neither disguise nor deny. Each word seemed to echo across the glittering hall, yet it was delivered so quietly that only she could feel the full measure of its truth. A sudden murmur rose near the gallery, the sharp clink of glasses or the whisper of an overheard word, yet neither of them faltered. The moment, fragile and intense, had crystallized, and Evangeline understood that public scrutiny, once a source of dread, could now serve as a mirror reflecting the courage she had cultivated. She lifted her gaze to meet the Duke's, the firelight and chandeliers entwining in their shared reflection, and felt the thrill of triumph mingled with anticipation. He bowed his head slightly, the motion both deferential and possessive, as though acknowledging her worth while claiming his own stake in her attention. "May I," he asked, voice soft, "demonstrate publicly what I have learned privately? Will you allow me the honor of declaring, however subtly, that my regard is sincere and that I intend no harm?" Evangeline's lips curved in the faintest smile, a quiet signal of consent. "You may, Your Grace," she whispered, the syllables steady despite the tumult of emotion coursing through her. "And in doing so, perhaps society will learn what I have long suspected, that dignity and discernment are not incompatible with admiration, nor is courage ever without reward." The Duke's eyes darkened with a rare intensity, a mixture of respect and desire, and he offered his arm. Together, they moved to the center of the ballroom, the music swaying around them like a river of silk and candlelight. Whispers followed, as expected, yet they no longer carried mockery alone. Curiosity and astonishment intertwined, and Evangeline felt the subtle thrill of power, not over him, but over her own presence, her own narrative. As the waltz carried them through a final, sweeping turn, he lowered his voice to a whisper only she could hear. "Know this, Miss Hartwell. Mockery may have brought us together. Curiosity has guided us. But it is truth, and nothing else, that shall bind us henceforth." The words struck her with the force of revelation, a quiet certainty amidst the swirl of silk, snow, and candlelight. Yet even as the music drew to its close and the guests' applause rang through the hall, a subtle tension remained. In the shadows of the gallery, a figure lingered, an onlooker whose gaze seemed sharper than mere curiosity. Society's scrutiny had not vanished. It waited, patient and watchful, ready to challenge or interrupt the fragile clarity they had found. Evangeline felt her pulse quicken, aware that the night's declarations were only the beginning, and that the world beyond the ballroom might still test the fragile bond forged in candlelight and confession. She glanced at the Duke, whose steady gaze met hers with an unspoken promise, and for a moment, the ballroom, the snow, and the murmuring society faded. The declaration had been made, the resolution begun, but the night was far from over, and whatever waited beyond the shadows might demand more courage, more trust, and perhaps a sacrifice of heart yet unseen. The snow had deepened outside Ashford Hall, blanketing the estate in a quiet hush that softened the world and turned the night into a private kingdom. Lanterns cast pools of amber light along the frost-kissed paths, and the distant trees were etched in silver against the starless sky. Evangeline Hartwell stepped from the great hall into the crisp night air, her breath forming delicate clouds that mingled with the soft mist rising from the frozen ground. The pearls at her throat glimmered faintly beneath her cloak, a testament to the evening's earlier tokens, and the rose she carried, carefully clasped to her chest, trembled in her fingers like a heartbeat of hope. The Duke of Ashford emerged from the shadows, his coat heavy against the snow, mask removed to reveal the intensity of eyes that had haunted her thoughts and dreams for weeks. There was no ballroom, no music, no audience tonight, only the quiet, infinite space between them and the fragile luminescence of lantern light. "You came," he said, voice low, almost a murmur against the hush of falling snow. "I feared the storm of gossip, the expectations of others, might deter you." Evangeline's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. "It is no storm that could keep me from truth, your grace," she said, her voice steady though her pulse raced. "And it is truth I seek tonight, as much as you, I suspect." Her eyes, luminous in the lantern glow, held both defiance and a fragile vulnerability. She had rehearsed these words in quiet solitude, yet the depth of their import struck her now with an almost physical force. He stepped closer, the faint crunch of snow beneath his boots marking each deliberate movement. "Then we are both prepared," he murmured, and in his gaze she read the complexity of a man long shrouded in masks. The cruelty of the past, the tenderness he had rarely displayed, and the longing he had tried to conceal. For a moment, the wind seemed to pause, as though the world itself acknowledged the gravity of what hung between them. The rose in her hand trembled slightly, and she extended it toward him, an offering at once delicate and defiant. He took it, his fingers brushing hers, sending a current through her that neither mockery nor charm had ever achieved. "This," he said softly, holding the bloom against the pale light, "is a symbol of patience, courage, and grace. Attributes I once overlooked, attributes I now cannot ignore." His words were deliberate, measured, yet laden with unrestrained emotion. Evangeline felt the sting of old humiliation fade, replaced by the warmth of recognition, as though years of whispered ridicule had been transformed into the quiet power of acknowledgement. Snow swirled around them, catching in his hair, dusting her cloak, yet neither noticed the cold. His hand sought hers again, this time in a grip that was both commanding and protective. "Evangeline," he said, and the sound of her name on his lips made it feel like the most sacred word in the world. "I have mocked, I have tested, I have faltered in ways I cannot excuse. Yet you have endured with a dignity that humbles me. And now I must speak plainly, if only for one night, in the hope that you might hear what the world has so far refused to acknowledge." Her breath caught, anticipation and fear entwined in her chest. "Speak, then," she whispered. "I am listening." His eyes softened, dark and luminous beneath the lantern light. "I love you," he said, the words simple, yet profound, a confession distilled from months of tension, misunderstanding, and unspoken desire. "I have admired your courage from afar, been captivated by your quiet strength, and now I see that no jest, no mockery, could ever diminish the truth that resides within you. Will you grant me the honor of your heart, Evangeline, not for the amusement of society, but for the promise of what we might share. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, a mingling of relief, triumph, and long-suppressed longing. She had endured humiliation, whispers, and society's relentless scrutiny, yet here, under the silvered sky, none of it mattered. Only this moment, this man, and the fragile, trembling truth between them endured. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I will." The Duke's lips curved into a rare, unguarded smile, and he drew her into an embrace that was both gentle and unyielding, a promise made manifest. The warmth of his coat, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and the quiet acknowledgement of shared vulnerability surrounded her like a shield against the world. For the first time, mockery and longing, shame and admiration were reconciled in the tender certainty of mutual recognition. A sudden noise, a carriage door, the faint stir of servants, reminded them that society, with its scrutiny and expectations, waited just beyond the lantern-lit garden. Yet neither flinched. The private triumph of this night, the revelation of truth, eclipsed the judgment of all others. They held each other, hearts beating in synchrony, aware that the world outside might whisper and speculate, but powerless to undo the bond forged in courage, honesty, and desire. The rose fell gently from her hand into the snow, petals dusted with frost, a quiet testament to the delicate beauty of their victory. He bent to retrieve it, brushing his lips across the soft blush of its bloom, and Evangeline felt a thrill of intimacy, of reverence, that spoke louder than any grand gesture or societal approval. They walked slowly toward the awaiting carriage, the soft crunch of snow underfoot punctuating each step, the lantern light casting long, interwoven shadows that mirrored the path they had traveled, through shame, curiosity, scandal, and revelation, toward this night of quiet triumph. Every glance they exchanged carried the weight of the journey behind them, the scars of past mockery softened by the unspoken promise of the future. And as the carriage door closed, shielding them from the world, Evangeline rested her head lightly against the Duke's shoulder, feeling the strength and warmth of the man who had once mocked her, now devoted entirely to her understanding and her heart. Outside, the snow continued its silent descent, pure and unrelenting, and the estate was transformed into a realm where whispers could not follow, where judgment held no sway, and where the long-awaited secret night had finally delivered its reckoning.